This is Your Anxiety Toolkit, episode number 138. Welcome to Your Anxiety Toolkit. I'm your host, Kimberly Quinlan. This podcast is fueled by three main goals. The first goal is to provide you with some extra tools to help you manage your anxiety. Second goal, to inspire you. Anxiety doesn't get to decide how you live your life. And number three, and I leave the best for last, is to provide you with one big, fat virtual hug. Because experiencing anxiety ain't easy. If that sounds good to you, let's go. Welcome back. Today is a very important day, a very exciting day, and one that I want us to all get excited about. Today is the first day where you can get ERP School, the online course. It is available. You can go to cbtschool.com to get it. Basically, it is a course I created for people who have OCD or for family members or for clinicians. And it basically teaches the steps that I take with my clients when treating OCD. We talk about psychoeducation. We talk about how to do ERP. We talk about what tools you're going to need. We talk about the specific subtypes of OCD and specific exposures and the response prevention you can do for each subtype. We have whole modules on troubleshooting. We have added a new module this year about self-compassion and the application of acceptance and commitment therapy. We also added a part on dialectical behavioral therapy and how that can be helpful for OCD treatment. It is almost 6-hour course now and something that I am so proud of. The reason we created ERP School is because I was having so many people reach out and say they couldn't afford treatment or they didn't have access to an ERP therapist. And I thought this is a really good opportunity to offer something to people when they don't have that opportunity. And I'm so excited to share it with you again. I do it twice a year and now is the time. So it will be available here until I think the 7th of March. Sometimes we change that depending on when people are, emailing and saying they're wanting to add a couple extra days. So I'm happy to do that if needed. And the course is $197. Again, that's for an almost 6-hour course. The reason we priced it at that is that's around what most ERP therapists charge per hour. And so we wanted to keep it super cheap for you all. Something to know is that once you access the course, you have unlimited access. It's not a course that runs at just specific times. Once you have it, you can watch it as many times as you want. It's there for you to use as much as you can. So go over to cbtschool.com, click on online courses, and it will be right there. Okay, so this episode is so in line with ERP School launch. I am so excited to share this with you because today we have Katy Marciniak. She is coming on to share her story about treatment of OCD and the amazing work she did with ERP and the amazing work she's doing on herself along the way. She shares some incredible and inspiring tools and tricks and concepts that I really wanted you to have. In fact, we only recorded this not very long ago, and I said to her, I feel like this is the perfect episode to have on the very beginning of ERP School launch because it really gives an insight as to what it's like, the steps, the different stages of recovery, and she's so open and so articulate. So thank you, Katy, for coming on. I'm going to use her episode as the I did a hard thing for the week because Katy did a hard thing and she's doing a hard thing, and I'm so proud to be a part of her journey. So I'm going to let us go straight over to the show. Again, I'm going to say, please, I encourage you, go over to at least check the website and see if it's something that you're interested in. If you have any questions, I'm going to be on social media a ton this week to talk with people, or you can email me directly. Go to CBT School. There's a contact page and you can ask me your questions there. So have a wonderful day, and I can't wait to share this episode with you. Well, welcome. I am so excited to have Katy Marciniak with us today. She was so kind to reach out to me to share her learnings about the journey of recovery. And I think she has so much amazing stuff to share. So thank you for coming on, Katy.
Yeah, thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Yeah, I'm really, really thrilled. So can you just give us a little bit of a background on you? And a lot of what we're going to be referencing today is a blog post that you wrote. Can you tell us a little bit about you and even that blog post you wrote?
Yeah, so my OCD experience started when I was young, probably way before I remember. But I was about the age of 12 when I had gotten really triggered by a horrific news event that had happened, the Columbine shooting, and it kind of created this inner experience with me that I had no idea what was happening. And now I know it was harm OCD, but it had terrified me so much that, I chose not to disclose it. And I think it really caused me a lot of agony over the years and compulsions I was hiding from my family. And I had asked, I had reached out to my parents for some reassurance. I never fully disclosed what I was going through. And it kind of just carried it with me for like a decade or more. And I just always had this fear of what therapy entailed, that I was going to be told I was crazy, that they would take me away and lock me up somewhere. And it was also very hard to, want to seek treatment at that time, knowing there was this horrible school shooting that just happened, and I'm not going to reveal these scary thoughts I'm happening to anybody out of fear that they're going to think I'm something that I'm not. That event terrified me, and what was going through my head also terrified me. So for like over a decade, it waxed and waned, but I always developed these compulsions to avoid violence, to avoid the news, to avoid anything that showed up that had to do with a weapon, guns, anything at all. And it kind of just followed with me, and my OCD kind of waxed and waned over the years, but then it started to latch on to different things. And as I like to say that I've taken the world tour of like OCD obsessions, much of which I didn't realize until I went to therapy, and I was like, oh, I have this, I have this, I have this. But I also know that content doesn't matter so much, and I'm learning to embrace it all as the same disorder. So eventually I kind of reached a point where I think I was in grad school, so like approximately 23. I kind of just thought to myself, like, something's not right. And I was trying to figure it out. And I think I just Googled something that was, I think at the time I was struggling with like checking compulsions. And I Googled it and it came up and I ended up on that. I think it was the IOCDF's website. And I was like, oh my gosh, like, I have this and I have this and I have this. Like, I am obsessive compulsive disorder. Like, I am like textbook definition. And it was kind of like this aha moment. And I was really grateful, and it was almost reassuring. But then there came this point where I was like, oh, but you need help for this. You have to go somewhere and you still have to tell somebody about this. And that part really scared me. And I really struggled with taking that step. And eventually I did. I reached out. It's funny, but it's not so funny. I had reached out to someone. Finally, I had gone through like the list of people. The first therapist I called never called me back. So I was like, oh, this was a rough start to therapy. And then the next person, I did it. I got diagnosed. I did some ERP. But I really found myself feeling like I had to be there. It was like I had to be there. I knew I needed help. But I was not disclosing everything. I was still keeping certain thoughts to myself. I didn't feel like completely safe in that environment. Nothing against that therapist. I didn't click, and it was tough. I dreaded going every week. And that was kind of like how my therapy experience progressed for a little while. And, to that therapist's credit, she did help me. Like, I got a diagnosis. I learned that ERP could work with certain obsessions, but, certain obsessions are just off the table for me to address in that setting. And eventually what happened is I met my wonderful husband, and life seemed great. And my OCD, I kind of like pushed to the side. I was like, oh, I can just deal with this. I'll always have it, but like, I'll always be able to cope. And, that was a very naive thought of mine. And I decided to stop going. And it wasn't until a few years later, after we got married, that it really started to like seep through the cracks, and I was seeing it everywhere. And I kind of just reached a point that I felt like I reached a breaking point. I was finding myself physically anxious all the time, having like mini panic attacks that I had never experienced in moments that would have typically brought me joy. And it really also started to go after my relationship with my husband, which was absolutely terrifying for me. And I was struggling to find, relationship OCD. I was like, this feels like OCD, but I couldn't find a lot on it. And at that point, my husband and I were like, I need to get some help. Like it felt like I couldn't do it by myself anymore. Like there were days that, I would just come home from work and I would just find myself crying and not knowing what was wrong, but knowing it wasn't right and it shouldn't be this way. So at that point, I started reaching out to other therapists, and I probably went through maybe 2 or 3 that just didn't work out. Like it wasn't the right fit. It wasn't an OCD specialist. And finally I was, my husband and I just decided like, we're going to find an OCD specialist. Like this is what you need. And we reached out to someone in the area that I had found, and since then it has changed my life. And, the first session I went to with my therapist, I left thinking like, not like, oh my gosh, I have to go back. I was like, I can't wait to go back. Like I was so excited to have had somebody that, validated my experience, and I really felt like got it. And it was, from that first day, I have to say I felt pretty safe in that environment. And to me, that was my sign that, this is a place I can work on this. This is a place I can, move forward and hopefully win back things that I felt like I had lost. And since then, like the last 4 years has kind of been, it's been an up and down journey, but my gosh, my view on therapy has changed like crazy in that time. And I wish everybody could just have that experience. And I just think it is such an empowering thing when you finally learn how to, take some control back from a disorder that really takes you out. And it, took out not just like things I was interested in or my passions, but it took out my self-worth. 10 years of not having treatment really, and not understanding that what I was experiencing wasn't in my control, and it wasn't like one with my identity, has really like changed my life. And I think or not changed my life, but that did damage on, who I thought I was. And therapy's really helped me pull me out of that. So
I love this story, and I think a lot of people will really resonate with your story in, how long it takes to get a diagnosis and how long it takes to find the right therapy. So I'm assuming the therapy you found was exposure and response prevention?
Yeah.
Great. Mm-hmm. So I'm going to reference your blog post because there's a few points I just adored. And for those listening, the blog post will be in the show notes. You said at the very beginning, at first, if you don't succeed, try again. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah. So I think for me, I went to therapy. Well, I decided not to go to therapy for over a decade, which was, was hard, but I think it's a process that I had to go through because of what I was experiencing. And I've had to come to terms with that a little bit, that I chose not to reach out. Not that people didn't offer to help. I chose not to go. And I think for me, I always thought like, oh, I'm going to therapy. Like I got to go. This first person is going to be the one that helps me. And it just wasn't like that for me. That first person helped me. It helped guide me on my journey, but it wasn't my final destination of the person that could really empower me and change my life. I think it's what I needed in the moment. And I think a lot of times people get defeated when, I've heard this from, family members or other people, that you go to the first person, it doesn't work out, and you think, oh, therapy's not for me. And I felt that a little bit after, like, oh, therapy's not for me. I'm better than this. Like I can do more. Like therapy means I'm weak. And it's really, the more therapists I went to, the more I started to feel that. And I think the worst place I found myself is like searching. It's like the psychologists, like Google search, where you find like a therapist in your area, and, comes up like 500 people that say they treat OCD. And like, that was terrifying for me. It's like, okay, this is hard enough for me to like try. And now I have to go through all these people to try to figure it out. So every time I reached out to someone, it was like, oh, I have to do this again. I have to do this again. And, each person I saw, well, they didn't always really help me. They kind of pushed me in the direction I needed to go. And this direction I needed to go with being honest with myself, that you need somebody that treats OCD and can really give you the resources you need And that took some time for me to work through that. And I think partially that's the system. And I think some of it was this stigma too that I carried with me, that I didn't always rebound quickly from the therapist that I decided I didn't need to see. And I think sometimes people also need to be honest with themselves about, like, is this therapy helping me? Because, at one point in my process, I was seeing someone that, like, I'd come home upset, or I really didn't want to go. And my husband was like, is this helping you? Like, therapy can be hard. And I know that, but it wasn't pushing me in the direction I wanted to go. And in that moment I had to say, like, this is really hard, but I need to stop going and start this process over again. And I think that's where that's coming from, the try again is, sometimes it's going to be hard. You're going to have to be honest with yourself and say, this isn't working. I got to go somewhere else. And I will never downplay that process, because it is still very hard for me. And like recently we added somebody else to my therapy team. And even 4 years into therapy, going to a new person was terrifying. So I think that is kind of where I was coming from in that part of the blog post.
And when you say there's no set time frame, what were you referring to?
Yeah, I think, I always laugh at my therapist, because I think, like, I've been it's been 3.5 years I've been working with him. And, when I showed up to his office, I was like, all right, like, we got this one obsession and we're just going to work through it and we're going to bust through it. And that's going to be that. And then I think I quickly realized there was so much more there than I had any idea, like, was actually upsetting me. It was layer after layer after layer. And I often joke with him, like, am I still going to be coming here when I'm 70 years old? And, that statement used to bother me when I said it to myself. Now it does not at all. Like, I think everybody's process in therapy is unique. And I think for some people, maybe it is like a couple months a year and you get the tools you need to go back into, your life and find the joy that you want. But, for me, I feel like it's often discouraging how much I felt like I had to go through, but it's just the time frame doesn't matter. And I think people get stuck on that sometimes. And I think the more we compare ourselves to other people's therapy journeys, the more hindrance we do to our own process. And I think, if you have to be in therapy your whole life, great. If that's what makes you happy and that's what guides you, then that's wonderful. But I think just sometimes losing those expectations of, like, how long it's going to take, because I know for me, something has always come up, and it's not, sometimes it's life, sometimes it's something inside that, I finally let out that just was another thing we needed to work on. And I think, so that's where the no time frame, I think, has been helpful for me to, like, change the way I think about therapy.
Right. I had a client once who said it's funny because she had accepted for her physical health that she would need to exercise for the rest of her life, right? That you don't just exercise till you're 30 and then you stop. But she said, but somehow with mental health, we assume we're got to get it done and then we're done. You know what I mean? It's funny how we mix that up, as we put that expectation that we're supposed to, like, get it done and then we're, no more mental health exercises for us.
Yeah.
Right. Okay, so good. So you said vulnerability is the friend you didn't know you need.
I did say that.
You're like, I'm regretting saying that now.
Yeah. So vulnerability, like, today is probably one of my most vulnerable moments I've ever had, just being on this podcast. And I'll be very honest about this. Like, I think I tried to make therapy work without being vulnerable. And it was kind of saying things without saying them, or not telling my therapist how I really felt. And it just didn't work. Like, quite honestly, it didn't work. And, there was a point in my therapy, and this wasn't exactly what he said, but, he kind of said, like, if you can't be vulnerable in therapy, where can you be? And I think it really made me think, like, oh, I'm paying to come here. It's taking up a lot of my time. If I'm going to come here and not talk and not explain how I feel, then I'm wasting my time and I'm wasting his time. And it's okay that it feels hard, and it's okay that it's a process for me. But I do need to challenge myself to be vulnerable in this setting, because this is my best chance to get better. And I think I found that when I was vulnerable, it was scary and it was hard and it terrified me. But those were the sessions that I left feeling a little bit of weight was taken off me, a little bit more empowered, and just like I had taken a step in the right direction. And I think that's just something that, I really encourage people to look at and be honest with themselves. Like, how vulnerable are you being? But I think with that being said, it's okay. Back to the point of like, sometimes not every therapist is the right therapist. I did not open up to that vulnerability till I found a therapist that was really helpful for me. And I think it's okay if you don't feel like you're in a safe environment to kind of wait till you find that therapist you really click with, because that can do more damage than good, depending on how you feel about that. So,
right. No, I really love that. I do. I think that the vulnerability is an exposure in and of itself, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah, absolutely. I hear a lot of people, often people will say, just me telling you my symptoms is an exposure. And they haven't even started exposure therapy yet,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Right. You said, and I keep quoting you, but I love it. It's okay, all of it. Tell us about that.
For me, therapy, something that surprised me was the amount of emotions that it brought out of me. And I think there were days that I cried. There were days that I laughed a lot. There was days that I left angry at my therapist. There's so many emotions. And I think early on, I kind of told myself, oh, you can't feel this way, or you shouldn't feel this way, or this isn't okay. And the more I learned to just embrace whatever emotion I was feeling inside and be okay with it, and still jump into ERP, or still be self-compassionate, or whatever it was, the easier the work got for me. I think the more we judge ourselves for how we're feeling, the more we're a hindrance to our own progress. And that has been and continues to be an incredible process for me. Like I still struggle with that sometimes, but I think the more we can kind of let it all just be there, the easier it is to do the work. So.
Right. So you're saying all the emotions are okay, like every single one.
Like, I think for me, one of the biggest things in therapy is just, you can't control how you're feeling. And I think for so much of my life, I tried to control it, that the more I started to just be like, oh, I'm feeling this and I'm feeling this, it was just liberating. And to feel it without adding the judgment of like, my therapist just said this thing to me and it made me really angry. Oh, I shouldn't feel angry at my therapist. Like, this person's changed my life. But it's okay to feel angry. Like, that doesn't help if we try to push it away. So I think that kind of like, that's just a good example of how it's helped for me.
Absolutely. So. Absolutely.
Actually, say one more thing about that. I think the one thing too with OCD, and especially ERP, that has helped me tremendously is humor. And I think there's this thought that like, oh, with these, for me, especially with harm thoughts, like, oh, you can't laugh during this exposure. Like, this isn't funny. Like, if my therapist says something funny, oh, you shouldn't laugh. Like, that word's not funny, Katy. Like, and, I found the more I can, like, yes, embrace the fear and the uncertainty and the exposure, but also allow myself to laugh if something naturally is just funny, really just lightens the mood and, like, takes the OCD out at its knees. And I think that is just really important for people to remember in ERP. Like, it's hard, it's scary, it's terrifying, but sometimes it is funny. And, like, it's okay that it's funny. I mean, OCD is crazy, the things it comes up with. And, like, sometimes I show up to therapy and I'm like, this obsession, and like, I can't get it out of my mouth. And then when I get it out, I'm like, that is ridiculous and hilarious. now let's work on it, because I don't want to have to like get stuck on this rest of the day.
Right. I actually am shocked. I remember even in my training is just how much you can be so afraid and crack up in the same session. I think it happens for a lot of people. Yeah. I love that. Okay. I know that your blog is around uncertainty. So tell us a little bit about the freedom in, accepting uncertainty.
So I think for much of my life, when you have OCD, you're trying to not accept uncertainty. You're doing the exact opposite. You're trying to be certain about everything. And I think when you start therapy for OCD, you really need to buy into this. Like, I think it's okay that it's scary, but I think I can tell you ERP works when you're motivated and you're ready to go after it. And I think it's hard because I think when you go into an exposure, that's really scary, you want to prove to yourself, you think you're trying to prove to yourself it's not going to happen or this thing isn't going to happen. And I think what you're actually doing is proving to yourself that you can be uncertain about what is going to happen or not going to happen. And I think that has been a big lesson for me. And I think the more I take, the small exposures I do in sessions with my therapist and really just move them to my life in general, in everything, OCD or not, I'm finding so much more joy in that. Like, I think when you're seeking certainty, you're trying to find reassurance, you're ruminating, you're doing all of these things that you think are going to bring joy to you, but they're actually sucking joy out of you. And I think when you turn to uncertainty, yeah, it's, initially it's hard. There's going to be anxiety. There's going to be this fear. There's going to be unsettling physical emotions, but you can feel all of that and still choose to like drive towards your values. And eventually you're going to start to see this joy and this happiness show up in places that you didn't think could ever show up. And I think that's where I have bought into the ERP. And I will be honest about this. There are things that I still struggle to do ERP towards, and I'm not quite there yet. But in the areas that I have, words can't express the amount of things I've won back from my OCD by really buying into those exposures. So.
Right. Yeah, I think that's such rich advice. And I love the way you share that, because I think that's very true in my experience as well. It's kind of miraculous how that joy can come in.
Yeah, and I found it kind of, what surprised me is where it came into my life. Like, I think for me, I was expecting, happiness was just going to be like this final destination I showed up at. And then I was going to be like, all right, we're done with therapy. Like, see ya. And that just was not what happened. I think gradually I started to see happiness seep in, or things that used to trigger me just didn't trigger me as much. And I think I started to see this joy in these very unexpected moments that were things I just didn't expect to see it in. And it was very mundane moments where it was, noticing something outside, or noticing the smile on my kid's face, or just feeling present in a moment I never would have been present in. And I think that has what's really changed my life, is that mindfulness to those present moments when I'm not ruminating, or when I'm not doing some type of compulsion.
Right.
So.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And you said that was actually one of your points about living in the moment, which I loved. You said, this is one I really loved: self-compassion, don't knock it till you try it.
Yeah. Me and self-compassion, we have a love-hate relationship. It's kind of been that way since it's been introduced to my life. It used to be a very hate relationship. I think, like, when my therapist was like, self-compassion, I was so resistant to it. So resistant. I was like, I don't deserve this. Like, why are you telling me to be kind to myself? Like, this is just, not for me. And, I will preach about self-compassion pretty passionately now, because I think it can change your life. And I think, I cannot control that I have OCD, or that I have to fight this, but there is one thing that I can always control, and that is how I choose to treat myself for having it or for struggling. And I think self-compassion was kind of a little bit of a turning point for me in my journey, because, I used to, if I couldn't do the hard exposure, I was beating myself up. If I struggled with something I thought I shouldn't be struggling with, I beat myself up. I carried a lot of self-hate from a lot of undiagnosed OCD. And I think self-compassion has really been, I think I said this in a different blog, it's kind of like that superpower we all have that we often tell ourselves we don't, but when we access it, it's like completely life-changing. And I think when you can turn to it, and when you turn to it in the moments you think you need it the least, it absolutely can change your perspective on yourself and your day. It has turned, moments around for me. It has turned days around for me. And I will be, I'm going to speak a little bit honestly about this right now. Like, I had a pretty rough mental health week this week, and I really struggled yesterday. And I think I had to, but before I went to bed, I was kind of like ruminating on something that I'd struggled with, and I was angry with myself. And I literally had to write out a self-compassion script. And I was like, I'm going to leave this with today. Like, common humanity, other people experience these things. And I went to bed, and that was that. And yesterday was that. And I think that is not something I ever would have done in the past. Like, what had bothered me yesterday would have bothered me for a very long time and really taken me out. And I think self-compassion is just this thing. Like, if you put it in your toolbox, you can literally grab it anytime you need it. And it's not easy. Like, I will say that it is very, very hard, especially when you have a disorder that's telling you to be mean to yourself for the things you're thinking. It's very much against what you feel you should be doing, but it can change the way you see yourself and the way you experience your world if you can start to use it. So.
Right. Would you be comfortable sharing with me what specific, I know you kind of gave a brief, but what your script was, just for some people who have never heard about a self-compassion script?
So let me try to think about.
Take your time.
So the first sentence, without going into like too much detail, I think the first sentence was, I'm feeling really angry and ashamed that I did this certain thing that was something was a coping behavior I shouldn't have been engaging in anymore. And then in the next sentence, I kind of had said, it's okay that I feel this way. Lots of people with mental health disorders have setbacks and may not completely follow their treatment plan on a linear trajectory. Other people are experiencing this like me. And then the last sentence was allowing I think I had said something along the lines of, I can choose to let this stop here and focus on my attention on this podcast, which I was doing tomorrow, which is really aligned with my values. And I kind of just broke it down that way. So this is how I'm feeling. It's okay to feel this way because other people experience these, and then focus on something I can do in the present moment that was more value focused or to distract myself from that.
Wonderful. So. Thank you for sharing that, because I think that sometimes people assume self-compassion is like rocking yourself to sleep, but I think you gave a great example of how to build it concretely.
Yeah.
Right. Thank you. That's so helpful. Okay. Give yourself the credit you deserve.
Yeah. This is a big one for me. And I think, if my therapist was on this podcast, he'd be like, yeah, Katy, you do that. So I think for me, especially early on, I really struggled to give myself credit when I had done an exposure. And I think where I struggled was, I always wanted to do the big exposure, the really hard one, the one that would just like knock my OCD out. And, sometimes we would start it and we'd realize, no, I'm not there yet. And we would have to like take it back a few steps in a session. On those days, though, I left very discouraged and feeling like I'd failed. And I think I hadn't failed at all. Like, I think I was still engaging in exposures. They just weren't where I wanted to be quite yet. And I think OCD is a really tough disorder because, it often takes so much from your life for so long that you just want to like knock it out in one like punch. And I think it's really hard to do that. And I think there's been some obsessions where I can do that. And there's some things where it really has to be this jumping all over the hierarchy. And I think it's been, I've learned that any win at all is a win worth celebrating for me and for anybody. I think, some days a win is doing level 10 on the hierarchy. Some days a win is like yesterday would be allowing myself to be self-compassionate when I really, really struggled. And I think that's where I think the credit is like, you can choose where to put the credit. It's not just assigned to one thing. You're not getting a grade. The therapist always tells me this, you're not getting a grade anymore. Like, it's just, I think just, you can assign the credit, like choose that thing during the day that you feel you deserve to get credit, even if it means you just got out of bed that day. That's something that you can celebrate. Having OCD is incredibly hard. And you just need to learn to celebrate the wins, or it starts to feel incredibly daunting. So,
yeah, I love that so much. I really resonate with that because I think the voice of OCD doesn't want you to celebrate. It's like, no.
Yeah.
Don't you dare. So I think that's beautiful that you're saying, no matter what, I'll celebrate it.
And I think sometimes too, like, and I actually just had this thought this week when I left therapy was, we often go to our therapist to help us. And I think, you want to go, by the time you get there, sometimes you're like, oh, I need help with this, this, and this, and this. And when we discuss the wins, sometimes I find that I don't even bring them up. Like, I don't mention them. And I think sometimes that makes the mentality feel like it's all losses. And it's not at all. Like, even this week where I struggled a little bit more than I had in the past, when I left therapy the other night, I was thinking, you struggled, but like you did not struggle nearly as much as you would have 2 years ago or 3 years ago. Like, and in my head, I was just tallying things that these small moments, where I was able to access something I couldn't have accessed in the past. And I think that those are the moments that I think you have to remember. Like, there's also a lot of positive eventually too. Like, it starts to even out, and eventually the positive side gets a little bit heavier as well. So.
Right. You had mentioned about isolating, like that it doesn't have to be isolating, that your recovery, it doesn't have to be just you alone.
Yeah. So, this one was a big one for me, and I've struggled with this, and I still struggle with this a little bit. I think, my OCD told me for so long that I could not share the details of what I was experiencing. So much of what I experienced in isolation, not like I was like put in a room by myself, but like I was in my head alone with what I was experiencing, and I didn't know I had OCD. So that was very isolating. And I think the more I was in therapy, the more, my therapist always pushed me, to try to find like a support group or something where I was around other people that understood, that weren't just him. Like, it was great that he understood, but I needed a different type of that support in my life. And it has been a very slow process for me. And I think, it kind of started with the blog and sharing my experiences through my writing, which kind of just naturally happened over the course of my therapy. And then eventually, where I go for therapy, they do have an OCD support group. And eventually I had chosen to go to group therapy for a little while, and it really, really helped me. And I think I don't currently do it anymore, but that period of time that I went really allowed me to open up and see that other people were experiencing things that I was experiencing. Or I went to the IOCDF conference, and that like blew my mind when I went. One of the biggest exposures I ever went to, and I left feeling like I had left like this giant family vacation of people that I didn't know but were in my family because their brains work the same way as me. So I think it's hard because your OCD tells you that you're alone and nobody gets it. Nobody can possibly understand what you're going through. And I think every time I've reached out, that has not been the case. People understand. There's like some brilliant, wonderful humans in the OCD community alone. And like just in my own community, I've found people in support groups I've connected with. And recently via social media on Instagram, there's a few people that I really identify with that are moms, and, we kind of lean on each other for support sometimes, not in a reassurance way at all. It's actually quite the opposite, that have really been supportive. And I think sometimes you just need, one person to get it. And I think what's been helpful for me is one person to get it outside of my family or outside of my immediate friend group. And I think that's just a process for everybody. And I think some people are willing to jump into it, some aren't. And I know like when I started group therapy, I was quiet. I didn't talk at all. Like they had to like pull things out of me. Like they thought I was in the military because I was so like straight faced and like didn't talk. And so that was a process. And by the end of it, I was talking. I think I actually was talking too much. So it really has been a journey for me with that. And I also think for people, like it always breaks my heart because I do have the resources to access therapy. And, there's a great therapist in my area, but not everybody has that. And I think the one thing that I would say to those people is, there are communities, places that you can find help and resources. And I think at the very least to just not feel like you're alone in what you're experiencing can help alleviate some of the suffering.
Yeah. It's funny. And that's that common humanity piece, right? Is just to know you actually, it's easy to say, I'm not the only person who feels this, but when you actually are immersed in other people feeling it, it feels more true, I think.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay. I'm going to ask you one last question. You said going to therapy simply won't solve everything.
Yeah. I mean, I think that was an eye-opener for me. I think, especially, early on when I started therapy was so helpful, and it really knocked out so many deep-rooted obsessions for me that I carried since I was a child. But the more I got into therapy, I started to find like, the wins would be followed by losses. And, I was kind of expecting to go to see my therapist and he could just give me this tool that like magically fixed it. By him saying it was going to make it all okay. But there was this part of it that I was missing. And I think sometimes I was doing it, but sometimes I wasn't. And I really had to look in the mirror at a certain point and be like, are you doing everything you possibly can to get better right now? And I think I was going to therapy, I was showing up, but my commitment to embracing the uncertainty or winning things back in my life outside of therapy was not quite there. And I really had to be honest with myself about that. No therapist is just going to magically fix anything. I think there's this accountability piece to it that you really, have to buy into. And I think that was really a turning point for me in my therapy. And sometimes I still struggle with it because I think everybody goes through ups and downs with like their motivation, or, you know, if you hit like a depressive patch. But I think every once in a while I have to like look at myself and say, like, am I not making progress because there's something I could do a little bit better, and be non-judgmental of myself in that process.
Right.
That's,
And so if you don't mind me asking, let's say you do a little self-evaluation and you kind of find that you're not showing up in this radical way. What do you do to sort of step forward from that place?
yeah, I mean, I think like at times, I think that moment has turned to self-hate. Like, I think I've been hard on myself and, you know, thought like, oh, I'm paying this pain to go to therapy. Why am I not like doing all the work? And I think those moments, like I had just said, like kind of have to start with self-compassion, and then kind of like pooling my resources and think, you know, what can I be doing to help me like daily? And sometimes that's, you know, as simple as imploring more structure, or making sure I'm going to the gym, or, you know, meditating. Meditation has always been helpful for me. The consistency of it keeps me structured. Sometimes it's like just those little things that fall through the cracks sometimes that end up being the big thing that kind of pulls me off track in therapy. And I think sometimes, like I said, I just think honesty with myself is really important. And I think sometimes it also requires my therapist to kind of be like, all right, let's reevaluate this. Like, something needs to change. And I think the one thing that still gets me sometimes is there is some anger for having OCD. And I think once in a while that will still trip me up. Like, I shouldn't have to do this. I should, like, everybody, like, nobody else has to do this. Like, it's like, you know, this easy thing of like exposure, like that's easy for everybody else. Like, I just shouldn't have to do that. And I think if I'm shooting like all over myself, then like it's just a sign for me that I really need to just buck up and be like, this is what I have to do to win my life back. I know this can work. It's worked in other things, and really jump back in full force into the therapy. I know that can actually help me.
Right. Oh my goodness. You're like a wealth of knowledge. I love it.
Thank you.
So I could ask you like a million more questions, but I want to be respectful of your time. Can you tell us where people can hear more about your wisdom?
My wisdom. So I have the blog. It's Navigating Uncertainty. Actually, I'm not sure if it's .com or it's navigatinguncertaintyblog.wordpress.com. And then I have an Instagram handle at Navigating Uncertainty that I use. I
love your Instagram.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So many, like, not gut punches, but like right to the point. Like right to the point. And I love the stuff you're doing on Instagram. So thank you. Really, really great. Is there anything else you feel you would like to share before we finish up?
I'm trying to think. I think, you know, there's one thing that my therapist said to me, and I might like totally kill this when I try to say it, but it's always been this thing I kind of like return to, and it's so simplistic, but I think I mentioned this a little bit before, and I think this just would have helped me from the beginning, or just in life in general before I went to therapy. I think you often see happiness as this like final destination and this thing that you're going to get to. And I think there was one point in my therapy that my therapist said something along the lines of like, it's not that the happy thoughts aren't there. You're just letting them go by without grabbing them when they're present, because I'm so focused on the negative thoughts or the ruminating thoughts. And it really, really opened my eyes. And I think sometimes when I'm struggling, like I think about that, and I think about it as like a conveyor belt, or however you want, clouds or a train. And I think, am I just letting these moments pass me by? And a lot of times I am. And I think if I can, you know, it's okay to feel uncertain and anxious and scared and still allow yourself to be happy. And I think that is the thing that really has changed my life and helped me drive towards my values. I think for so long, I felt like I had to figure it all out before I could let happiness in. You know, there'd be these moments where I was ruminating or uncertain, and I would have this moment of like, but this wonderful thing's happening. And I would say, oh, you don't deserve that. You don't deserve to feel that right now. Let it go by, Katy. And I think now I'm just realizing like happiness and joy like always is around you, even in like the toughest moments. And I think the more I reach out and just let that experience be there, that's when I see like these really empowering, profound moments in my life where I'm like, oh, like it can be scary and terrifying and I can be anxious, but this is really beautiful and empowering, and like wow, I'm happy. Like I feel happy, and like that may last for like 3 seconds or it may last for like a week. And I think it's okay that it comes and goes, but if you never let it in, you're never going to feel it. I think no matter where you are in your process, that's just something you can let yourself feel, because it doesn't mean you have to be recovered to feel it. I still go through ups and downs all the time, but the downs are a lot easier if I'm still letting some positive in.
Right.
So.
Oh, I love that you mentioned that. Thank you. Thank you. So thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you for having me. I really appreciate it.
Please note that this podcast or any other resources from cbtschool.com should not replace professional mental health care. If you feel you would benefit, please reach out to a provider in your area. Have a wonderful day, and thank you for supporting cbtschool.com.